speaker. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Matthieu, and he's with the University of Miami's Cooperative Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Studies. So Matthew's going to be talking today about the upper ocean conditions in the Gulf of Mexico during Hurricane Michael. And Matthieu, I'm going to pull up your presentation here. And if you can see that, go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
Yep, I'm ready. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody, for attending this series of presentations. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Ricardo Dominguez, George Aliwell, Jun Zhang, Francis Bringas, Gustavo Goni from NOAA AOML, and Hunso Kim from EMC, and I forget other people here. There's a long list. I would like to acknowledge our partners, the Navy, the various IUS regional associations, the University of Miami. This work is supported by NOAA 2019 disaster supplemental. And next slide. So yeah, this presentation is present results from effort towards assessing how ocean observations can improve the representation of the ocean within operational models, and the overarching objective is to improve hurricane intensity forecast. And this presentation focuses on Hurricane Michael. We see a satellite picture of it, that Hurricane Michael hit Florida, the Florida Panhandle on October 10 in 2018. It was the first Category 5 hurricane to hit continental US since Hurricane Andrew in 1992. It followed a very rapid intensification because the storm came from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in about 3 days. So that's extremely short. Next slide. And as similar hurricanes that evolved over the Gulf of Mexico, the Hurricane Michael was influenced by local ocean conditions. And more specifically, the hurricane encountered one detached loop current eddy that is a warm core anticyclonic eddy that we see on the picture on the left. The picture on the left is tropical cyclone heat potential, and we see the large warm core eddy in the center. There was also a secondary smaller anticyclonic eddy also associated with warm water that we see a little to the northeast, next to the track of the hurricane. And in addition to that, the area was influenced by large Mississippi River plume that we see on satellite sea surface salinity on the right panel, with low salinity associated with the river plume. And previous presentations showed that low salinity near the surface are prone to form barrier layer, which induce a very strong stratification that makes it very difficult for the hurricane to mix, and that tends to strengthen the high temperatures near the surface. Next slide. In addition to these conditions, the northeastern Gulf of Mexico in early October 2018 was much warmer than usual, with anomalies of about 1 degree Celsius or more. And the Navy had 2 gliders deployed in that region, one just south of the Mississippi Delta. Next slide. So here we see the time evolution of the vertical structure measured by that glider between 24 hours preceding the passage of the hurricane to 72 hours, 3 days after the passage of the storm. And we see that basically the temperature structure doesn't change in that area that is influenced by the river plume, and basically the ocean remains very hot near the surface. Under the hurricane track to the east, next slide please, we see the glider was deployed inside the secondary warm core anticyclonic eddy that I mentioned earlier, and we see that the upper layer structure is very different, with a very thick layer of warm waters. So the black line denotes the water warmer than 26 degrees Celsius. And we see that during the passage of the storm in the upper ocean cooled, but by quite a small amount. And the result is that the waters remain warmer than 28 degrees Celsius throughout the passage of the storm. Next slide. So in order to complement this assessment, we performed numerical simulations, and we first ran ocean simulations with the HICOM model, and those simulations were then used as initial conditions for coupled HWRF HICOM forecast model. So I'm going to present a few simulations. The first one is one that is forced to represent climatological conditions based on the Navy GDEM4 climatology. A second simulation assimilates all available ocean observations, except for the gliders actually, but altimetry data, sea surface temperature from satellite, and in situ float data are simulated inside this reference simulation that we will call OOPS. And a third simulation is just a free-running simulation that has no constraint from observations. And these simulations were all started on January 1st, 2018, because it takes time for the model to ingest observations in case of data assimilation. And next slide. So first, I'm going to present the impact of these various constraints on the ocean fields themselves. So in the center column, we see the fields in early October derived from the reference OLAP simulation that assimilates observations. And at the top, we see with the sea surface height, the retracted loop current, and also the warm core loop current eddy and the secondary anticyclonic eddy, and that are associated with high tropical cyclone heat potential that we see in the center. And at the bottom, we see that this simulation has very large sea surface temperatures. Next slide. Now, the climatological simulation has a much more diffuse loop current that we see at the top, and is associated with a very low tropical cyclone heat potential inside the Gulf of Mexico and quite mild temperatures. And finally, next slide. The NOAA simulation happens to also have a retracted loop current, but there is no loop current eddy just north of it in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. And as a result, the TCHP is much lower than in the OLAPS reference simulation. And finally, the SST is also much colder. Next slide. In the result of that, if we look at the coupled simulations now that are initialized by these simulations, I've present here the enthalpy fluxes in the coupled simulations, first initialized from the OLAPS ocean simulation on the left and the NOAA's ocean simulation on the right. And we see this is around 25 degrees north, so that's the center of the Gulf of Mexico on the eastern side. And we see that the enthalpy fluxes are double in the case of realistic ocean conditions compared to the simulation that doesn't have any data assimilation. So that, of course, will have an impact on the hurricane wind intensity forecast. Next slide. So this is a one forecast cycle initialized on October 6, 2018 at 6 p.m., 18:00 hour. And we see on the left is the tracks of the hurricane in the various simulations compared with observation in gray. And we see that basically all the tracks are quite close and to the observed one and realistic. However, if we look at the right panel, in terms of intensity, only the simulation that is initialized with realistic ocean, the OLAPS case in red, reaches wind intensity that is comparable with observations in gray. So the simulation reaches a category 4, and the hurricane was just reached category 5 upon landfall. And however, the other two simulations, forced with climatological fields or without any data assimilation, those simulations reach only category 1 or 2. Next slide. And in additional numerical simulations, we analyzed the impact of various ocean observations to perform through observing system experiments. So we run the ocean model with assimilating first only the Argo float profiles, and this is called add Argo. Another simulation in which we assimilate only satellite SST, and finally a simulation in which we assimilate only altimetry data. And those three cases are to be compared with the OLAPS case and the NOAA case, which are supposed to be the best and the worst cases. And we perform statistical analysis over 4 forecast cycles initialized every 6 hours on October 6, 2018, which is at the early stage of the storm before it evolved over the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide. So this is the root mean square error for all those simulations during the evolution of the storm over the Gulf of Mexico. The x-axis is the latitude, so the storm started on the left and went up north to the right. And we see that on average, the coupled simulations forced with the NOAA case have an error of about 33.6 knots in wind intensity. And surprisingly, the case in which we assimilate only altimetry has a slightly larger error at 40 knots. So assimilating altimetry alone in that case is not very useful. The assimilation of SST only or Argo floats only lead to about between 20 and 30% error reduction, and the best case is achieved when we assimilate all available observations with a 32% error reduction. Next slide. We then focused also on the wind intensity upon landfall at 29.5 degrees north. So this table summarizes the mean winds reached by the various types of simulations and the associated errors. So the NOAA case reached the storm close to landfall reached 77 knots, which corresponds to a Category 1 hurricane. If we only assimilate altimetry, the wind dropped to 60 knots and the error increased. So again, that shows that altimetry alone is inefficient in that specific study case. Now, the assimilation of SST alone and Argo floats alone lead to a 35 to 30% error reduction compared to the case forced by the NOAA simulation. And finally, the OLOPS case in which we assimilate all observations in the ocean lead to the most realistic case with a strong Category 3 hurricane upon landfall, close to landfall, and a reduction of the error of 56%. So next, this brings me to the conclusion. So the Gulf of Mexico conditions with initially warm SSTs in the northeastern Gulf and large TCHP associated with the eddy field, as well as low salinity due to the Mississippi River plume, help maintain SSTs warmer than 28 degrees Celsius during the evolution of Hurricane Michael, and that those contributed to sustaining and favoring its intensification. The realistic initial ocean conditions led to a realistic intensification of the hurricane in the coupled forecast model, and that was not obtained with the ocean climatology or in the absence of data assimilation in the ocean model. This correct representation of the upper ocean conditions led to much more intense enthalpy fluxes at the ocean atmosphere interface. And on average, the assimilation of ocean observations led to a 32% error reduction with respect to the absence of data assimilation in the ocean, and that peaked to 56% error reduction upon landfall. And in that specific case, the Argo data and SST data alone led to improvement, but not so much, not the altimetry data alone, and this is due to the mean sea level in the HICOM simulation compared to observation, so it gets tricky in the loop current area, and that's something to keep in mind. And the main conclusion is that the correct representation of the ocean leads to reduced error in hurricane intensity forecast, and that is best achieved by assimilation of a combination of observations. The altimetry is useful to constrain the circulation and the mesoscale features. The floats, vertical profilers are very useful to correct the temperature biases. And finally, gliders are able to resolve horizontal gradients, which was not so clear here, but also to detect the low salinity features very near the surface. And with this, I will thank you. Next slide. And yeah, these results are to be submitted soon for publication, and I will stop here and thank you.